Hello, I'm John Northcott. Time now for your weekend business panel. Here's a look at some of the stories that we're tracking for you. A new survey released by the Business Development Bank of Canada suggests that 55% of small and medium-sized businesses can't find enough workers, and that is having an impact on growth. Also ahead, global supply chains continue to experience setbacks due to the pandemic, how the interruptions might affect your shopping plans. And Statistics Canada reveals the gross domestic product dropped 0.1% in July. Well, here to talk about all of that and more, Jeannie Shim is the founder and president of consultancy firm Housing Lab Toronto, an independent housing research and consulting company. And Danielle Park is a lawyer and financial analyst with Venable Park Investment Counsel. Okay, welcome to you both. All these three topics are potentially huge and potentially going to be on our plates for quite a while. But let's start with that labor shortage. Not enough qualified workers available for employers who need them. Statistics Canada reports GDP contracted in July. So how does this all play out? Jeannie, do you want to start us off?
Well, the GDP number is not surprising. The numbers from July, we've only started opening up our economy. So in theory, the GDP growth, we should start seeing that. But on the other hand, we have this labor shortage. The BDC report is just one of, a whole line of reports we've seen over the past several months and years talking about this looming labor shortage. Just walk down in your street, right? And every window there's a help wanted sign. So the BDC report wasn't surprising. Earlier, I think RBC also released a report this week talking about skilled labor shortage, about 700,000 people retiring in the upcoming decade. Earlier this year, a construction report talking about construction trades and the number of retirees happening there. And we already have issues with supply and housing in particular. So clearly there's a lot of signs out there, and I hope that the government really wakes up and starts to address these issues more seriously now. Okay, we talk about addressing them, and it's a grade 10 economics, I seem to recall, supply and demand. So you have a shortage of workers. Does this mean, Danielle, you've got to pay them more, you've got to offer them more perks? Where is all this headed to address the labor shortage?
Well, you have to increase productivity, because remember, workers times productivity equals GDP, right? That's a basic kind of a formula. So what we have to do is figure out, I think there's a couple of main problems here. One, we don't have the right workers with the right skills, but in Canada, we increasingly have the wrong sectors being the heavyweight drivers of our economy. And we've underinvested in the things that we need to improve that for the future. So we have a big piece ahead of us here in transforming our economy, and it has to happen now over the next 8 years, because by 2030, I think we're going to be seeing a fundamentally different world in terms of transportation, energy, and agriculture. And those are, in addition to housing, which has been our main driver of growth, of course, which is not sustainable, and therefore we have a problem in how to generate economic growth. So it is the other major thing that came out of some of the surveys this week was that 38% of Canadian small businesses are falling behind on their rent. That, in addition to all the businesses that went out of business. So it's a function of instability in our business sectors, in the companies themselves. And, the workers have figured out that some of that instability is not a good place to try and go find work. Like, what's the point of getting a job in a company that's not going to make it, or in a sector that's in decline? And I think that mismatch of worker skills and the correct sectors to drive the economy is our biggest problem right now.
Jeannie, are those some of the factors that you're talking about, the government intervening on and keeping a close eye on?
Yeah, I mean, where there's challenges, there's always opportunities, right? And I think there's three immediate things. I mean, on the immigration side, that's almost like a quick fix, right? We can try to make sure that the immigrants that we're bringing into this country match the skills that we need immediately. Secondly, we need a lot more collaboration with the provincial governments on the whole education system, making sure that we are kind of teaching our kids and building the pipeline with the skills necessary, and not skewing it to everybody has to go to university. There's tons of jobs available in the skilled trades, and they're great jobs and they pay really well. And then the third thing is research and development. I think consistently for decades, the OECD has reported Canada is one of the lowest in terms of investing in research and development. We need to modernize our many industries. And again, I work in the housing sector, and housing is a great example. We're still building the way we did in the 1950s and 60s. There's so many opportunities to modernize, to increase that productivity that Danielle spoke about as well.
Certainly my buddies in the trades have had maybe the busiest summer of their careers, so we'll keep an eye on that. Global supply chains continue, of course, to be impacted by interruptions, cost of fuel, shortage of shipping containers, all of that. Let's talk about how that's going to affect moving forwards. Danielle, your thoughts on the supply chain situation, which is, by many reports, dire.
Yeah, I think we've had a perfect storm of, a bulk in a huge jump in consumption of goods, which happened because of the support from governments and the at-home shift that happened during the pandemic. And we saw that in everyone desperate to get every kind of good there is. But as I've mentioned before, these are durable goods. They have a shelf life or a lasting of several years. They're not something that typically gets consumed and replenished every single year. And so I think what's happened now is there's been this kind of panic response in the global supply chain of how do we get more supply? So they're bringing over and companies are putting in orders for product they presume they're going to need a year from now. So now we've really got this massive amount of orders in the system, just as I think demand is now turning down. And we see that in new orders, for example, in the United States already. We see that in the credit impulse globally, which tends to lead manufacturing by about 12 months. So all that has really been coming back off the boil since March. But I don't think the frenzied panic to get goods into consumers' hands has yet reflected the reality of that declining growth. So I think we're going to end up with inventory rebuilding over the next few months, and that will then result in too much goods overwhelming demand again.
Still, though, Jeannie, they're talking about people having to start your Christmas shopping right now, everything from bicycles to running shoes to cars. What's your take on the supply chain situation right now?
Well, I think that whole start your Christmas shopping is crazy, but anyway, but talking about supply chain, it's interesting, we see a slowdown in GDP growth, people are expecting this V-shaped recovery, but really supply chain is a big question mark. And no doubt we're seeing shortages across the sector, and it's been reflected for consumers in prices. We've seen, I think in August, the latest inflation numbers came up and said we've seen the highest monthly inflation since 2003. And that's not surprising, right? We're seeing it in food, shortages in cars, prices of everything has gone up. So I think that's the immediate impact on consumers. And long term, I think this speaks to the fact that we live in a global economy. It doesn't matter if Canada's 80% vaccinated. What about those countries where a lot of these goods and parts are produced? They're also suffering with labor shortages, perhaps, or shutdowns because their COVID situations are a lot different than ours. So I think that long term, maybe these are opportunities looking at Canada for onshoring, bringing some manufacturing back to our country. Are there opportunities for us to develop a domestic capacity so we don't have to rely as much on kind of global players? I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that do need to be looked at, though, because this issue is not going away.
Danielle, what should consumers take from all of this?
I think they should worry less about consuming goods and worry more about paying down their debt and building up their savings. And looking for services, for example, there's been a huge influx of need for mental health services, for health services, for diet and exercise consultation. There's a whole bunch of services that could be very productive. It's just the goods obsession that we've had in the past decade, particularly buying consumer goods on credit. I think we've really run to the end of that. And so that's why I think we're in a really exciting transformation here. But the question is, what will drive growth? I mean, GDP in Canada is still 2% lower than it was pre-pandemic, and we've already turned down in terms of the global impulse and growth rate. So I think Canada's in for a challenging bit here.
Just about 2 minutes left, so we'll call this last one the lightning round. But you mentioned growth, Danielle. Much of the Chinese economy has been driven by growth, by real estate growth. Concerns about Evergrande, $300 billion. Not only that, but the whole sector, trillions of dollars potentially if there's a loss of confidence, if Evergrande somehow goes down. Jeannie, your take on what many people are worried around the world about with this giant real estate company in China?
Well, I think this is indicative and maybe the tip of the iceberg of the whole growth strategy of China over the past several decades, right? It's a massive investment in infrastructure and real estate as the drivers of growth, regardless of whether there was demand or not. You see crazy videos on YouTube, right, of whole towers being demolished, and you wonder if it's fake news because it's just incredible to think that. So you wonder, we've always questioned whether the growth numbers coming out of China have been real. This strategy of this company of just growing and using debt to leverage further growth, it eventually does catch up, right, because demand is slowing down in China, COVID notwithstanding, if you just look at their demographics and kind of looking to the future. So I think that this is where there's smoke, there's fire, right? I read someone said, and I think that we should be looking at this long term. And I think, though, in the short term, I don't think the government's going to let this company fail. They can sell off their assets. It's too big to fail, and the government will probably step in to help them.
I had a chance to spend a fair bit of time in China in the early 2000s to watch just absolutely exponential growth. Every few months you'd come back to a new city and there'd be another ring road and another huge development. Danielle, in the 30, 40 seconds we have left, what's your take on what is going on with Evergrande and the implications for China's and the world's economy?
Right. So it's the business model that's imploding. And I think that has much broader ramifications than just Evergrande. I think it means a lot, a shifting under the Chinese economy and the growth model that they've adopted, this levering up and levering up. They've built over now 90 million units that are empty, and there's a slowing of migration to cities. But at the same time, there's lessons here for Canada, because again, this was also our main model. Since the commodities bubble burst in 2008-11, we've really doubled down on building up the housing sector, the property sector. It's become the main generator of GDP growth in the country. And it's not sustainable because we're already at massive amounts of overbuilding in that sector and too much debt. And the answer is lower prices. The answer is not how do we get more housing at ridiculously high prices and how do we get more credit into the hands of consumers. It's how do we get housing costs down, back to productivity, efficiency. That's what we need to do now.
Guys, I want to thank you. You've set the table for what may be probably months of discussions with these themes weaving their way through. I want to thank you, though, for joining us today on the Weekend Business Panel. Jeannie Shim, founder and president of the consultancy firm Housing Lab Toronto, an independent housing research and consulting company. Danielle Park, a lawyer and financial analyst at Venable Park Investment Counsel. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. Remember, you can watch the Weekend Business Panel every Saturday. Tune in right after your news updates at 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on CBC News Network.